In this session, we are going to solve some easy numericals to help understand the basic concepts and the relationship between contribution, fixed cost, how to calculate profit, or even for that matter, sales, variable cost, contribution, and PV ratio, margin of safety, so on and so forth. The question that we will be tackling in this case, the basic information is the same with differences in the scenarios like slight change in the volume of sales or selling price or variable cost, so on and so forth, right? So for the sake of calculation, to make it a little easy, I'm going to do it on an Excel sheet. The basic information that has been given to us is that the sales volume is 1 lakh units at 1 lakh rupees. So total sales is 1 lakh rupees. So per unit cost sales is going to be 1 rupee. Variable cost is 40,000 and fixed cost is 50,000. Now let us calculate the PV ratio, BEP, sales and the margin of safety. Now for the sake of calculation here, I'll be directly putting the figures in the column and using the formulas. The sales amount given here is 1 lakh rupees. The variable cost is 40,000. Therefore, the contribution is going to be 1 lakh minus the variable cost, that is 60,000. Fixed cost is given to us as 50,000. Profit is calculated as contribution minus the fixed cost, that is 10,000. PV ratio, which is also known as the contribution sales ratio, is calculated as contribution, that is 60,000, divided by the sales, that is 1 lakh. So here the CS ratio is 0.6. The BEP is calculated as fixed cost divided by the PV ratio. Here the fixed cost is 50,000. We divide it with the CS ratio and we get the BEP sales. That is, we require a sales amount of 83,333 to recover all our variable cost as well as the fixed cost. Margin of safety is the difference between the sales and the BEP, break-even point. So in this case, the sales is 1 lakh minus the BEP sales 83,333. Therefore, the margin of safety is 16,666. Now suppose there is a change. That is, there is 20% increase in the physical sales volume. That is, the quantity of units sold has increased by 20%. So initially we had sold 1 lakh units. 20% increase would mean 1 lakh units plus 20%, that is 1,20,000. So the amount of sales will also increase. Now, sorry, this is the sales volume, right? Now here you can see that there is an increase in the volume as well as the sales by 20% because you have increased the quantity by 20%. Now if the quantity increases, naturally the variable cost, which is directly in proportion with the units sold or manufactured, will also increase by 20%. So initially it was 40,000, which will now increase by 20%. So now it will become 48,000. Contribution will increase, that is sales minus the variable cost, it will become 72. Fixed cost is the same, that is 50,000, and profits will be contribution minus the fixed cost, that is 22,000. Now, as long as the selling price and the variable cost per unit remain constant, your PV ratio will always remain constant. You can see here contribution divided by sales, it is coming to 0.6 itself. So, even if the volume changes, the PV ratio will remain same if your selling price and the variable cost is the same. BEP will change because BEP will also remain the same here but margin of safety will change. BEP is fixed cost divided by the CS ratio, that is 83,333. Now you have increased the sales, therefore your margin of safety is also going to increase to 36,666. Now suppose there is a decrease in the physical volume. So instead of 1 lakh, you are now selling 20% less. So your sales is going to be only 80,000, right? Sales is 80,000. Variable cost will also decrease proportionately. So it will now become 32,000. Contribution will be 80 minus 32,000, that is 48. Fixed cost remains same at 50,000 and profit will now be negative since you are unable to recover the fixed cost. But if you check the PV ratio, which is contribution upon the sales, it will remain same because the selling price has not changed. Variable cost has also not changed for per unit. The BEP will also remain the same because fixed cost is also same, it hasn't changed. But there won't be any margin of safety as your sales are less than the BEP, right? Now in this case, there's a 5% increase in the variable cost. Now sales are the same, that is 1 lakh. But your variable cost has increased by 5%. So 40,000 plus 5%. So that is 42,000. So contribution is going to be 1 lakh minus variable cost. Now here, since the variable cost has changed, you will see that the PV ratio will also change. Fixed cost is same 50,000 and profit will be contribution minus the fixed cost, that is 8,000. Now check out what is the impact on the PV ratio. Because the variable cost has changed, there will be a change in the PV ratio as well, which will now be 5.8. Because there is a change in the PV ratio, your BEP will also change, which will now become 86,206, and so will your margin of safety, right? So I had told you earlier, like if your PV ratio is, let's say, 60, right? So that means that in sales, out of sales, 60% is your contribution and 40% is going to be your variable cost, right? So, but if your variable cost becomes 45%, naturally your contribution will reduce to 55%. So what is happening? Definitely the contribution is changing, so your PV ratio will also change. So you need to remember that. Now in this case, there is a 5% decrease in the variable cost. We just finished the decrease. Here there was increase in variable cost. Here it is decrease in variable cost. So sales will remain the same. Variable cost will decrease. So contribution will increase and fixed cost remains the same. So your PV ratio, what will happen to the PV ratio? It will change. It will increase because your variable cost is decreasing. And your BEP will also change because of the change in the PV factor. It will now become 80,645. Margin of safety will be sales minus the BEP, that is the break-even point. Now suppose there is a change in the 10% increase in the fixed cost. So variable cost is the same, that is 40,000. Contribution will be 10,000 minus 40,000. So PV ratio will remain the same, but fixed cost is increasing by 10%. So 50,000 plus 10%, it will become 55. Profits will be contribution minus the fixed cost, that is 5,000. Now because here the selling price and variable cost are the same, your PV ratio is going to remain the same. But your fixed cost has changed, therefore your BEP is going to change, right? and that will also have an impact on your margin of safety. Going ahead now, what have they said? 10% decrease in the selling price. Give me one sec, I'll just erase this. 10% decrease in the selling price and 10% increase in the sales volume. Now sales volume increase means you were currently selling 1 lakh units. So now you will sell 10% more, right? So your sales volume will be 1,10,000. Selling price has decreased. There is decrease in the selling price by 10%. Earlier you were selling for 1 rupee. Now you will sell it 10% less. That is 90 paisa. So your sales are going to be 1,10,000 multiplied by this new selling price, that is decreased by 10%. It is going to be 99. Variable cost. Now there is a change in the sales volume. That means volume has increased by 10%. Variable cost will also increase by 10%. Contribution will now be sales minus the variable cost, 55. Fixed cost is the same, that is 50,000, and profit would be contribution minus the fixed cost, right? Now remember here the selling price has changed, therefore it will impact the PV ratio. So the new PV ratio will be contribution divided by sales, that is 0.555. Because your PV ratio has changed, your break-even point of sales is also going to change and your margin of safety will also change, right? Going on to the last scenario, 10% increase in the selling price. So your current selling price was 1 rupee. 10% increase will become 1.1. Volume has decreased by 10%. So volume decrease will be 1 lakh less 10%, that is 90,000. So sales here is going to be selling price of 1.1 and the quantity 90,000, that is 99. Now sales volume has decreased, therefore variable cost is also going to decrease. So variable cost will be 36. Variable cost will decrease proportionately, that is 10%. Sales minus the variable cost will give you contribution. Fixed cost is the same, 50,000, and profits will be contribution minus the fixed cost, that is 13,000. PV ratio will change because there is a change in the selling price. So contribution divided by sales is the PV ratio. BEP will be 50,000 fixed cost divided by the PV ratio, and margin of safety is going to be sales minus the BEP break-even point sales, that is 20,428. So these are the slight variations which will help you to understand which element will change because of change in the selling price or the variable cost, etc. So change in the volume will impact the amount of sales as well as the variable cost, because variable costs are assumed to be directly in proportional to the quantity produced or sold, right? I hope these concepts help you to understand marginal costing and solve more complex questions in the future. Thank you.